Welcome to NibblePop Stories. Today we will hear the story of Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. Dominica, a Caribbean island near Jamaica, became a British colony in 1763. In 1834, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which ended slavery throughout its colonies. Our story begins around that time. Antoinette Causeway lives on the decaying Colibri estate in Dominica with her mother, Annette, her brother, Pierre, and their servant, Christophine. The Causeways had once owned slaves and were promised compensation for freeing them, but they have received none. Antoinette's father, Alexander Causeway, has died, and her mother struggles to maintain the estate, which had relied on slave labor. The freed slaves, now resentful, often mock Antoinette and her mother, calling them white cockroaches. One day, they even poison Annette's horse. The Causeways are outsiders in Dominica. Antoinette, her mother, and her brother are Creoles, whites of European descent, born in the West Indies. Annette is seen as an outsider by the white elite, and with their wealth gone, even the respect of the black community has disappeared, leaving the Causeways isolated and powerless. Pierre stumbles when he walks and struggles to speak clearly. He spends most of his time in bed. Annette devotes much of her time and energy to caring for him, leaving Antoinette largely alone. In her solitude, Antoinette turns to Christophine for love and support. Christophine, once a slave, had been given to Annette as a wedding gift by Antoinette's father. She is believed to possess supernatural powers, and the local black community keeps their distance from her. After the horse is poisoned, Annette withdraws into the house, isolating herself from the outside world. A doctor visits to assess Pierre's condition, but offers little hope for improvement, which deeply affects Annette. She grows thin and silent. When Antoinette tries to reach out to her, Annette pushes her away. Feeling lonely and abandoned, Antoinette spends her time in the garden playing with Tia, a young black girl. They swim together every day, forming a brief friendship. One day, however, Tia tricks Antoinette and steals her money. The two exchange insults. Antoinette calls Tia a nigger, and Tia counters by calling Antoinette a white nigger, which she says is even worse. Tia leaves wearing Antoinette's dress and leaving her with Tia's old, worn one. Humiliated, Antoinette is forced to walk home in Tia's clothes. Relatives of a deceased neighbor, the Luttrells, arrive to settle at the neighboring plantation. They bring a sense of liveliness back into Annette's life, filling the house with dancing, music, and parties. They lend Annette a horse and introduce her to Mr. Mason, a wealthy English widower. Soon after, Annette marries Mr. Mason. At the wedding, the guests gossip about Annette, questioning why Mr. Mason would choose to marry her. While the couple honeymoons in Trinidad, Antoinette and Pierre stay with their Aunt Cora in Spanish Town. By the time the family returns to Colibri, the estate has been restored, clean, tidy, and repaired. Mr. Mason has financed the necessary improvements. He also hires new servants, including Manny and Myra, to manage the household chores. After about a year of marriage, tension begins to build between Annette, and Mr. Mason, leading to frequent arguments. Antoinette is desperate to leave Colibri. She is convinced that the locals now despise her more than ever, especially since she has regained her wealth. Mr. Mason, however, dismisses her fears. He insists that everything is under control. He refuses to believe that the former slaves might still hold resentment. He thinks that the blacks are too lazy to be dangerous. One night, Antoinette goes to bed waiting for Christophine, who never arrives. She is restless. She gets up and goes downstairs, only to find a mob of angry black servants gathered outside, shouting and throwing rocks at the house. Before long, they set the house on fire. In the chaos, Antoinette barely manages to pull an almost lifeless Pierre from his burning crib, while Aunt Cora leads them all to safety. As flames consume the house, Antoinette tries to return inside to save her pet parrot Coco, but Mr. Mason stops her. Tragically, Coco falls to the ground with his wings on fire, unable to escape due to his clipped wings. Antoinette spots Tia in the crowd and runs towards her, believing Tia has come to help. But instead of offering friendship, Tia throws a rock at Antoinette, striking her on the forehead. Antoinette collapses from the blow. The family quickly escapes in a carriage to town. Pierre dies on the way to town. Antoinette falls ill for 6 weeks, and Antoinette is sent to the countryside to recover. Antoinette returns to Spanish Town with Aunt Cora, who enrolls her in a convent school. Life at the convent becomes a rare oasis of peace. There she learns the manners and virtues expected of a lady, practices sewing, and studies the lives of saints. Yet, despite the tranquility, Antoinette remains troubled, preoccupied with thoughts of sin and haunted by worries about her mother. She prays for Antoinette, but no one will tell her what has become of her. When Antoinette is 16, her mother dies. The emotional trauma leaves Antoinette disoriented and feeling disconnected from what little remains of her family. When she turns 17, Mr. Mason declares that it is time for her to leave the convent. She will live with him, Aunt Cora, and his son. He hints that one of his English friends, whom he has invited to Jamaica, might take an interest in her. That night, Antoinette has another disturbing dream of walking through a forest with someone who hates her. She wakes in distress and tells a nun that she dreamed she was in hell. The nun offers her hot chocolate and calls it an evil dream she should try to forget. As Antoinette sips the hot chocolate, fragmented memories of her mother's funeral resurface. The dream and her mother's death seem to blend into one haunting memory, leaving Antoinette disturbed and confused. She asks the nun why terrible things happen, but the nun has no answer. After Mr. Mason's death, his son Richard, Antoinette's half-brother, arranges a marriage between her and Edward Rochester. Before the wedding, Rochester falls ill with a fever that confines him to bed for 3 weeks, during which he questions his decision to marry a Creole woman he barely knows. However, the financial incentive was too high to ignore. Richard Mason offers him £30,000 to marry Antoinette. The money saves Rochester from financial ruin and dependence on his older brother. The wedding is rushed, leaving little room for reflection. Following the ceremony, the couple, accompanied by a servant named Amelie, spend several weeks honeymooning at a small estate in the Windward Islands. This estate once belonged to Antoinette's mother, and Antoinette feels an intimate connection to the place, warmly greeting familiar faces and calling out names as they pass by. For Rochester, however, everything feels strange and unfamiliar. An alien world far removed from his own. When introduced to the household staff, Rochester takes an immediate dislike to Christophine. As they dine by candlelight, moths and beetles throw themselves into the flames, burning to death. The couple engages in a conversation about their homelands, Rochester's England and Antoinette's Jamaica, arguing over which feels more real. Rochester believes reality lies in the presence of people, streets, and houses, while Antoinette insists that true reality is found in rivers, mountains, and nature. Later, they take a quiet walk along the veranda. During their stroll, Antoinette shares a story about sleeping outdoors under the moonlight, admitting that Christophine had harshly scolded her for it. The next morning, Rochester wakes to find Antoinette silently watching him. Christophine soon arrives with breakfast, her presence always unsettling to him. He resents the way her skirt drags along the floor, the tone of her speech, and the quiet confidence with which she carries herself. He voices his disapproval to Antoinette, but she brushes off his complaints, telling him that he simply does not understand their way of life. As the weeks pass, Rochester gradually begins to forget his initial doubts about marrying Antoinette. The pleasant weather eases his mind, and he spends his mornings in the cool waters of the bathing pool, where Antoinette joins him in the afternoons. In the evenings, they sit together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, bathed in the warm glow of twilight. During these moments, Antoinette shares stories about the history of the place and her memories of it. Rochester becomes aware of the duality in Antoinette's nature. By day, she is cheerful and engaging, but at night, a shadow seems to fall over her. She grows distant, lost in her own thoughts. During one of these somber moments, she confesses the pain of her lonely childhood. Happiness frightens her. She fears it is too fleeting and that it will be taken from her as easily as it came. Though their attraction is intense, they remain strangers in many ways. Rochester feels desire, but not love. And although they find brief happiness, a fragile tension underlies their relationship. This uneasy peace is disrupted one day when Rochester receives a letter from a man named Daniel Causeway. Daniel introduces himself as an illegitimate son of Mr. Causeway and expresses bitterness over being left in poverty while Antoinette lives a life of privilege. The letter warns Rochester that he has been deceived by the Masons into marrying a woman he knows nothing about. Daniel claims that madness runs in Antoinette's family, her father, mother, and brother all afflicted by it. He recounts how Antoinette's mother, Annette, descended into insanity, even attempting to kill her husband. Daniel hints that Mr. Mason and Rochester have both fallen under a dangerous spell. He ends the letter by inviting Rochester to visit him, promising even more revelations. When Rochester returns to the house, he walks into a heated argument between Antoinette and the servant Amelie. Amelie taunts Antoinette, suggesting that Rochester is already growing tired of their honeymoon. In a flash of fury, Antoinette slaps Amelie, and the two women fight fiercely. Rochester steps in to separate them just as Christophine, the old servant, enters the room. She announces that she will leave, making it clear she dislikes the new master of the house and that his presence has disturbed the delicate balance of the household. After Christophine's departure, silence settles between Rochester and Antoinette. Rochester wanders deep into the forest. As he walks beneath the dense canopy of trees, he recalls Daniel's letter. He is convinced that he has been deceived. Antoinette visits Christophine, confessing that her husband hates her and no longer shares her bed. His silence and cold manner have become unbearable. Christophine advises Antoinette to leave him, suggesting that only in her absence will Rochester realize her value and perhaps seek a reunion. Antoinette hesitates, fearing that if she leaves, society will mock her as a failure. Then Christophine encourages her to take whatever money she can and leave for good. Antoinette reminds her that under English law, her wealth now legally belongs to her husband. Desperate to renew Rochester's affection, Antoinette begs Christophine to make a love potion. Christophine warns that such a potion can spark only desire, not love. Despite her hesitation, she ultimately agrees, with one condition: Antoinette must have an open conversation with Rochester before using the potion. Antoinette agrees to this condition and departs. While Antoinette struggles with her deteriorating relationship, Rochester visits Daniel Causeway. Daniel speaks bitterly about the mistreatment he endured from his father. Daniel not only defames, claiming she has been in jail and practices black magic, but also insults Antoinette's character. Before Rochester leaves, Daniel tries to blackmail him, demanding $500 to keep quiet. Rochester, however, refuses to give in to his threats. That evening, as promised to Christophine, Antoinette attempts to have a conversation with Rochester. He confronts her about the letters he received from Daniel. When Rochester refers to him as Daniel Causeway, Antoinette corrects him, saying the man's real name is Daniel Boyd. She charges Daniel as a liar who is determined to ruin her. Then Rochester questions her about her mother and her supposed madness. Antoinette insists that her mother was not insane. Rather, she was a victim of tragic circumstances. After losing her first husband and facing poverty, her second marriage brought new challenges: the Black Workers' Rebellion and the death of her son. Antoinette explains that her mother blamed Mr. Mason for these losses, seeing him as weak and incapable. When she couldn't recover from the loss of her son, Mr. Mason placed her in a country home. However, Antoinette discovered that the caretakers were abusive. They made her drunk and molested her regularly. Rochester listens but struggles to believe Antoinette. The poison planted by Daniel's lies has already taken root. He begins to see Antoinette as unstable, her beauty fading under the weight of suspicion. He starts calling her Bertha, a name she never uses. It's as if Rochester is trying to erase Antoinette's identity, forcing her into the image of someone else, someone he can control. Antoinette administers the love potion to Rochester that night. He comes to her bed and they make love. Yet, even as they lie together, Antoinette feels that the potion has only ignited physical desire, not genuine love. After she falls asleep, Rochester leaves her bed, retreating to his sitting room. He suspects he has been drugged. Believing Christophine is behind it, he vows to have her arrested if she tries anything like it again. When Amelie brings food to his room, He seduces her and sleeps with her. The next morning, Antoinette discovers that Rochester has slept with Amélie. Crushed by despair, she turns to alcohol and calls out for Christophine. When Christophine arrives, she confronts Rochester for his cruelty, accusing him of destroying the only place where Antoinette felt safe, her home. She begs him to show Antoinette even a small measure of kindness, or at the very least, leave her enough money so that Christophine can care for her. But Rochester dismisses her with cold indifference. He laughs at Christophine, denies any responsibility for Antoinette's suffering, and shifts the blame onto her. In the end, he threatens to have her arrested for practicing black magic if she dares to interfere further. With no other option, Christophine prepares to leave. Before departing, she asks what will become of Antoinette. Rochester replies that he plans to take her back to Jamaica to consult with doctors. Christophine, however, suspects his true intent is to have Antoinette confined, just as her mother was. Powerless to stop him, she leaves, abandoning Antoinette to her fate. The moment Christophine is gone, Rochester puts his plans into action. He writes a letter to his father explaining the situation and drafts another to a firm of lawyers in Spanish Town, requesting a furnished house and a staff of servants for his arrival. A few days later, with all the preparations complete, Rochester and Antoinette are ready to depart. For a fleeting moment, Rochester wonders if he has been wrong in his treatment of Antoinette. Perhaps Daniel Causeway's words were nothing but lies. As he glances at Antoinette, who stands silently, gazing out at the sea, memories of happy time resurface. He finds himself longing for those moments again, wishing things could have been different. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he turns to Antoinette and whispers, "I've made a terrible mistake. Forgive me." But instead of softening, Antoinette's eyes blaze with hatred. The damage is too deep, and no apology can undo it. Nearby, a nameless boy begins to cry. Antoinette reminds Rochester that she promised the boy they would take him with them when they left. Rochester's expression hardens as he replies coldly, "You had no right to make promises on my behalf." As they descend the mountains, Rochester's thoughts grow darker. He feels suffocated by everything around him, the houses and the lush tropical landscape. He resolves not to keep the house, knowing how much it means to Antoinette. The very thought of its existence unsettles him. Determined to cut all ties with the past, he decides to sell it, erasing it from both their history and future. Months pass. With the deaths of his father and brother, Rochester inherits the family estate and fortune. After spending some time in Jamaica, he returns to England. At his estate, he employs Grace Poole, whose sole duty is to care for Antoinette and prevent any rumors from spreading about her. Rochester wants nothing more to do with his wife, confining her to a secluded section of the house. Antoinette's world shrinks to the cold, shadowy rooms of her apartment, where Grace is ordered to always remain by her side. Antoinette is disoriented and confused. Her thoughts are fragmented, and she cannot remember how she ended up in this strange, dark place. Time has lost all meaning. She feels detached from reality, like a ghost lingering in a world that no longer belongs to her. Though she has been told she is in England, she refuses to believe it. Her memories of the sea voyage with Rochester are vague. She recalls being on a ship, but she feels certain they lost their way. There are no mirrors in her room, and Antoinette no longer knows what she looks like. She remembers gazing into a mirror in her youth, but that reflection feels distant, almost unreal. Without a mirror, she feels even more disconnected from her identity. One morning, Antoinette wakes with her body aching, though she has no recollection of how she was hurt. Grace reminds her of what happened the night before. Richard Mason had come to see her, insisting on a meeting. When he explained that he could not legally interfere between her and Rochester, Antoinette tried to stab him. After the knife was taken from her, she bit his arm. As Grace recounts the events, fragments of a memory return. How Richard initially failed to recognize her, speaking to her as though she were a stranger. Antoinette believes that if she had worn her red dress, Richard would have recognized her and rescued her from this cold, isolated place. Antoinette has a recurring dream. In it, she waits for Grace to fall asleep, slips the keys from her grasp, and wanders the dark hallways of the manor, carrying a flickering candle. She enters a grand room and sits on a soft sofa. Suddenly, she hears footsteps and feels the urgent need to escape before she is caught. In her panic, the candle touches the curtains, setting them ablaze. The fire spreads quickly to a tablecloth, and soon the entire room is consumed by fire. As Antoinette runs through the burning house, visions from her childhood flash before her eyes, her Aunt Cora, and the parrot that burned during the fire at Colibri. In the distance, she hears someone call out to her, but the voice does not use her name. It calls her Bertha, a name she does not recognize as her own. Antoinette races up a flight of stairs. Reaching the top of the house, she steps outside and peers over the edge, wondering if she should jump. As she gazes down, she sees Tia waiting below. Just as Antoinette begins to fall, she wakes from the dream, screaming. Her cry awakens Grace. She checks on Antoinette briefly before returning to sleep. Once Grace is asleep again, Antoinette rises from her bed. Taking the candle in her hand, she slips out into the dark hallways, just as in her dreams. At this point, it becomes clear that Antoinette's character parallels the mad wife in Jane Eyre. We are left to assume that Antoinette is about to reenact the events of her dream. In Jane Eyre, the mad wife dies in the fire. Now, it seems that Antoinette is about to follow the same tragic path, living out her grim fate. So how do you feel about the ending? Do let us know in the comments below. Some people say that you need to know the story of Jane Eyre to know the story of White Sargasso Sea. But isn't it a story complete in itself? Do let us know about your thoughts on this. And if you like our podcast, subscribe to us and stay connected. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Good night.